There are moments, and they come most often in this particular quality of stillness, when the room has gone dark and the sounds of the day have finally receded to the far edges of your awareness, and the body has begun, almost without being asked, to release the particular weight it carries through its waking hours. When something about the silence feels different from ordinary silence, denser and more inhabited, as though the quiet that has gathered around you is not simply the absence of noise, but the presence of something else, something patient and very old, and not indifferent to the fact of your being here, something that has been waiting for exactly this quality of stillness in which to become perceptible, the way certain stars only become visible when you stop looking directly at them and allow the darker part of your vision to do what the focused part cannot. You may have felt this in a forest, if you have ever sat in one long enough to stop moving through it and begin to simply be in it. That particular moment when the distinction between yourself and your surroundings becomes slightly less absolute than it was a few minutes ago. When the tree you are sitting beside stops being background and becomes something more like company. When the soil beneath you stops being a surface and starts to feel like it is also attending, in its slow and mineral way, to the quality of the air between you and everything else. As though the forest has been having a conversation that predates your arrival and has simply, without making a point of it, included you in it. You are listening to Midnight Sleep Chronicles, and tonight our archives open around one of the oldest and most quietly radical questions available to a human consciousness lying in the dark at the end of a day. A question that science, in this particular decade, is for the first time developing instruments sensitive enough to begin taking its measure, and that every traditional culture that has ever lived close to the land answered with a certainty so complete it shaped their languages, their ceremonies, the grammar of their most ordinary sentences, a certainty that did not need to be stated because it was embedded in the way they described everything else. Tonight we ask, what if the living world is not a backdrop to consciousness, but its most ancient and most patient expression? And what if we, with our language and our questions and our brief illuminated attention, are simply the part of the forest that recently learned to wonder about itself, the part that grew a nervous system sensitive enough to ask the question that the rest of the forest has simply been living as an answer, continuously, for longer than the question has existed? Let whatever is holding you hold you a little more completely now, and let the breath find its own depth, and let the sounds of wherever you are become simply the particular sound of this particular place on this particular night, neither obstacle nor invitation, simply present, simply what is here. And let us begin. Imagine a forest at the hour when the day is becoming night. Not any specific forest, not the one you may have walked through as a child or the one you can see from a window on the better days, but a composite forest, the forest that lives somewhere in the deeper part of the imagination, where all forests merge into a single forest, where the specific species and the specific light and the specific smell of a particular ecosystem distill into something more essential, the quality of what a forest is when you strip away everything accidental and leave only what is permanent, only what has been there in every forest, in every latitude, since before the first human being stood at the edge of one and felt what you are about to feel. The trees in this forest are old enough that the lowest branches begin well above the height of a standing person, old enough that the bark has accumulated its particular depth and texture across centuries of weather, old enough that the root system spreading beneath the leaf litter in the soil is as extensive below ground as the canopy is above ground, a mirror architecture in the dark, a second tree growing downward with the same patience and the same slow ambition as the one growing toward the light, reaching outward through the mineral dark in every direction, the way the canopy reaches outward through the air, both of them exploring, both of them finding, both of them building the particular shape of this individual tree's relationship with the particular piece of the world it has claimed as its own over the course of its centuries. It is the hour of transition, the hour when the light is neither day nor night, but something between them. When the sky above the canopy has shifted from the hard brightness of afternoon to something softer and more uncertain, and when the forest floor, receiving this altered light through its layers of branch and leaf, takes on the quality of a room in which the lamps have not yet been lit, but the darkness has not yet arrived. A quality of suspension, of the world holding its breath between one state and another, between the motion of the day and the stillness of the night, between the forest as a place you move through and the forest as something that moves through you. And it is at this particular threshold, in this particular quality of light, that the forest is most itself, most fully what it has always been, most available to be received by a consciousness that has grown still enough to receive it. You are standing at the edge of this forest, and the silence that surrounds you is not empty, but composed of the small and intermittent sound of a bird settling somewhere in the canopy, and the faint stirring of leaves in a breath of air that you can barely feel on your face, and the very distant sound of water, and the particular quality of stillness between those sounds that is different from the stillness of an empty room or an empty street. A stillness that is active, that has texture, that feels as though it is composed not of absence, but of presences that have simply agreed, for this hour, to become quiet enough to be felt rather than heard. Presences that have been here long before you arrived, and will be here long after you leave, and that are, in their patient and unhurried way, as aware of your standing at this edge as you are of theirs. And as you take a step into the forest, and then another, the light changes character above you as the canopy closes in, and the last of the evening sky is filtered through layers of branch and leaf. And the smell changes too. It loses the open quality of the ground behind you and becomes something more complex and more layered. Simultaneously, the smell of something decomposing and something about to grow, the smell of the continuous transformation of matter from one form into another. That is what a healthy forest smells like at any latitude and in any season. The smell of life processing itself in the particular silence that this hour makes available. And if you are very still, and if you are willing to extend your patience beyond the usual patience of a person with somewhere to be, something else begins to become perceptible. Something beneath the smell, and beneath the sound, and beneath the particular quality of the light. Something that has been there all along, that simply requires this quality of attention to become accessible. Beneath your feet, in the few inches of soil between the soles of your shoes and the bedrock, something is happening that has been happening for 450 million years, since long before there were forests as we understand them, since long before there were trees, since the first land plants were colonizing the edges of the ancient continents, and the fungi that would become their partners were already threading their impossible fineness through the mineral dark of the primordial soil, already doing what they are doing right now beneath you, in this imagined forest, in every real forest that exists on the surface of the earth tonight, in the soil beneath every meadow and every patch of untouched ground, doing it continuously, doing it in the dark, doing it without ceremony, doing it the way the heart does what the heart does. Not because it decides to, but because it is what it is, and what it is has been shaped by 450 million years of being exactly this. This network operates at a scale your nervous system was not built to perceive. Too fine, too slow, too distributed, too patient for anything calibrated to the speed and the drama of an animal's life to register directly. And yet, it is there, undeniably and completely there, present in a way that does not require your perception to validate it, filling the lightless space beneath your feet with a complexity that exceeds anything your senses were designed to perceive. A single gram of the soil you are standing on containing kilometers of fungal filaments so impossibly fine that thousands of them side by side would not equal the width of a human hair, yet so numerous that their combined length in this small pinch of earth exceeds anything the imagination easily accommodates, reaching numbers that the mind accepts as numerals without being able to genuinely inhabit them as distances, the way it accepts the distances between galaxies, present but incomprehensible, real but beyond the scale at which the human nervous system was calibrated to feel wonder. These filaments reach through the soil in every direction, and when they encounter the roots of the trees above them, something begins that the word relationship, with its connotations of choice and mutuality, describes better than the word mechanism. Though the process is chemical, and the chemistry is precise, and the precision is the product of millions of years of natural selection rather than any intention either party could be said to hold, the fungus penetrating the root tissue or wrapping around it or threading between its cells depending on the type, and at the point of contact an exchange beginning that is as old as terrestrial life. That is in some meaningful sense the reason terrestrial life became possible. That is one of the foundational partnerships on which the entire architecture of the living world above the ground is built, and has been built, and will continue to be built as long as there are forests and the darkness beneath them. The fungus gives the tree phosphorus and nitrogen, nutrients that it retrieves from the soil in forms and from locations that the tree's own roots could not access. Because the filaments are so fine that they navigate the chemistry of the soil at a resolution that the blunt instrument of a root tip cannot match, finding minerals in crevices and crusts and the surfaces of particles that are simply beyond the tree's reach without this partner. And the tree gives the fungus sugar, the carbon-rich product of photosynthesis, the energy that sunlight and chlorophyll have been converting from the atmosphere all day, a currency that the fungus, unable to harvest light, cannot produce for itself, so that what emerges from this meeting of root and filament in the dark is not competition and not parasitism, but something older and stranger and more fundamental than either, something that the word exchange only begins to describe, because it does not capture the depth of the entanglement, the degree to which neither partner is fully itself without the other, the degree to which the boundary between tree and fungus in the soil beneath this forest is not a boundary at all, but a gradation, a slow dissolving of one form of life into another, that has been happening for so long that the two have shaped each other's evolution beyond the point where either could be fully understood in isolation. This is, at its most basic level, the story of the mycorrhizal network, the wood wide web, the underground architecture that connects more than 80% of all land plants on the surface of the earth in a web of relationship that makes the internet, with its decades of existence and its billions of nodes, look recent and provisional by comparison. But the story has another layer, a layer that was noticed first as an anomaly, a detail that did not fit the expected picture, a result that arrived at the edge of the data and sat there quietly, not dramatic enough to announce itself, but persistent enough that the researchers who kept encountering it eventually had to decide what to do with it. And what they found when they sat with the anomaly long enough to design the experiments that could characterize it, was something that changed the texture of the question. Carbon was moving between trees. Not from the atmosphere to the tree through photosynthesis, which everyone expected, but from one tree to another tree through the soil and the fungal network, arriving in the tissues of a tree that had not produced it, arriving in a quantity that could not be explained by diffusion or by root contact, or by any of the passive physical mechanisms that matter normally moves through. And the ecologist Suzanne Simard, who spent years designing experiments to understand this transfer and tagging carbon with isotopic markers and applying it to the leaves of one tree and tracking it as it moved through the system, watching it arrive in the tissues of neighboring trees, and particularly in the tissues of young trees growing in the shade of older ones. Trees that were in the early years of their lives, in the understory where light was scarce, and the carbon budget was tight, and the margin between surviving and not surviving was narrow enough that the arrival of carbon from outside their own photosynthesis could make the difference. She called the large and old and deeply networked trees at the center of these transfers the mother trees, a name that was not intended as metaphor, or rather that was intended as exactly the kind of metaphor that is more accurate than a purely technical description, the kind that arrives when a careful observer has watched something long enough that the technical vocabulary has begun to feel insufficient, has begun to leave out something essential about what is actually happening. What was happening looked, from the outside, like something functioning as care. Like something functioning as the kind of resource transfer that moves from those who have more toward those who have less. From the established toward the vulnerable. From the old, whose photosynthetic capacity exceeds their needs, toward the young, whose needs exceed their photosynthetic capacity. Not because any individual tree decided to be generous, not in the way that a person decides to share what they have, but in a way that produces the same functional result, the same pattern of distribution, the same ecological consequence as generosity, regardless of whether it is accompanied by anything that deserves to be called intention, and whether that distinction between the form of generosity and its substance, between the pattern of care and its experience, ultimately matters is one of the questions that tonight we are not going to resolve, but are going to hold. The way you hold a stone that has been warmed by a fire, feeling its particular weight and its particular warmth, without needing to understand the physics of how the warmth got there. And the forest is also speaking through the air. Because when a tree is attacked, when the specific mandibles of a specific insect begin making their specific pattern of damage in the tissue of a specific leaf, something changes in the chemistry of that leaf, and then in the chemistry of the branch, and then in the chemistry of the volatile compounds released into the air from the tree's surface. A change so precise and so specific that the trees nearby, when those particular molecules arrive at their own leaf surfaces and are received by the receptor proteins tuned to exactly this chemical signature, begin producing defensive compounds before the attacker arrives at their own leaves, on the basis of the signal they received from a neighbor who is already under assault, manufacturing the bitter proteins and the sticky resins and the compounds that make their tissue less hospitable to the insect that is, as far as their own direct experience can tell, nowhere near them yet. A preparation made in response to a warning received through the air. A warning so precise that the researchers Heidi Appel and Rex Cockcroft found, when they played recordings of caterpillar feeding vibrations to plants that had no caterpillar anywhere near them, that the plants produced more defensive compounds in anticipation of a threat they had only, in some sense, heard, and that they did not respond in the same way to the vibrations of wind or of other insects, that they were distinguishing between signals, that they were, in whatever vocabulary we choose to apply to a system, without eardrums, without a nervous system, without any of the apparatus through which we would normally recognize discrimination between stimuli, deciding what required a response and what did not, and responding accordingly in a way that changed their future. And then there is the mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, the one whose leaves fold so dramatically at the lightest touch that watching it for the first time feels like watching something genuinely startled. A folding that happens faster than the eye can follow if you are not expecting it. The leaves, collapsing inward in a cascade from the point of contact outward along the stem. The whole structure taking on a sudden closed and defensive quality that in any animal would be immediately legible as the response to threat. And when the ecologist Monica Galliano began dropping mimosa plants repeatedly from the same small height onto the same surface, watching their response each time, what she observed was a gradual cessation of the response, a learning that this particular fall was not a threat, that the metabolic cost of closing the leaves and waiting and recovering was not worth paying for a stimulus that had consistently failed to be followed by damage, while the plants continued to fold immediately and completely when a new kind of disturbance arrived. When a touch came from an unexpected direction, or the drop was from a different height, or the surface was different. A discrimination between the familiar harmless and the novel unknown, a distinction that was maintained for weeks after the experiment ended, in whatever form plant memory takes, in whatever molecular configuration or chemical gradient or ion channel state constitutes. In a plant, the equivalent of what a nervous system uses to hold the past available for shaping the future. The pea plant, Pisum sativum, went further still, because when Galliano trained pea plants to associate the sound of a fan with the direction of light, the way that Pavlov's dog was trained to associate the sound of a bell with the arrival of food, the plants, given a choice of which direction to grow in the absence of light, grew toward the sound, toward the stimulus that had been paired with what they needed, demonstrating the kind of associative learning that had previously been considered the exclusive property of nervous systems, and doing so without a brain and without neurons and without synapses and without any structure that any neuroscientist would recognize as the substrate of memory, doing it in the deep and distributed way that plants do everything. Not in a concentrated organ, but spread through every cell, not stored in a dedicated architecture, but present in the chemistry of the whole organism. The way the memory of winter is stored not in one place in the body of a deciduous tree, but in the changed configuration of 10,000 decisions made in every meristem and every bud during the months of cold. Stay with this for a moment. Not with the large and perhaps unanswerable question of whether plants are conscious in the way that you are conscious, but with the smaller and more immediate fact that the world you walk through every day has been doing something that we did not think it was doing, has been learning and remembering and signaling and adjusting in a silence so complete and a patience so vast that 400 million years passed before anyone thought to ask whether there was something happening in there worth asking about. And as the breath deepens and the thinking loosens toward the particular softness of this hour, let us carry that fact with us into the older part of the story, the part that does not begin in a laboratory, that does not begin anywhere that has a date, that begins instead in the long centuries before science had a name, when human beings stood in forests and felt what you may have felt standing beneath an old tree, and answered the feeling not with a controlled trial, but with a story, and not just one story, but many, arising independently across cultures that had no contact with each other, pointing from their very different directions toward the same territory. The same territory that the isotope tracers and the laser vibrometry and the careful experiments with pea plants have been approaching from the opposite direction, arriving now at the same edge that the stories always knew was there, long before the Wood Wide Web had a name, before the controlled experiments and the isotope markers and the instruments capable of measuring what a leaf hears, people knew. Not the way a scientist knows. Not with the particular kind of certainty that a replicated result provides, but in a different kind of knowing. The kind that accumulates slowly in bodies that spend their lives in a landscape and passes down through generations not as information, but as attention, encoded in story and ceremony, and the specific vocabulary of languages that grew up inside particular ecosystems and developed their grammar in intimate and centuries-long conversation with what those ecosystems required their speakers to notice. A knowing so deep it became invisible, the way the deepest assumptions always become invisible, present in every sentence and in no sentence in particular. Begin in the forests of ancient Greece, in the dappled shade of oak groves that covered the limestone hills above the olive-planted valleys, and encounter the dryads, not as creatures to be believed in or dismissed, not as the charming fictions of people who had not yet developed the tools of science, but as the Greek language's most precise available answer to the same question that Monica Galliano was asking in a laboratory 25 centuries later. What is the nature of the presence I am feeling, standing here among these trees? And how do I describe it in a way that acknowledges what I am actually feeling, rather than reducing it to something my existing categories can comfortably accommodate? A dryad was a tree spirit, but the word spirit in its modern usage has been domesticated into something softer and less demanding than what the Greeks meant, something that can be acknowledged in a poem and ignored in practice. Whereas what the Greeks meant was something more ontologically serious, a presence that constituted the tree's being in the world, a presence so completely entangled with the tree's own existence that when the tree died, the dryad died with it, that the tree's life and the spirit's life were not parallel but identical. Two aspects of one event. The way the color blue is not in the light and not in the eye, but in what happens at their meeting, inseparable from either without ceasing to be itself, and the specific type called hamadryads, from the Greek for together and tree, were born when their tree was born and ceased when their tree ceased, and this detail is in fact the most philosophically rigorous element of the story, because it refuses the separation that causes us difficulty when we try to think about planned experience today. The separation between a consciousness and the body it inhabits. The assumption that experience is something that could in principle be removed from its form and still be itself, because the hamadryad cannot be removed from her tree. She is not a consciousness that happens to be living in a tree the way a bird lives in a tree, but what the tree's existence is. It's like from the inside. The Greek language's way of acknowledging that the tree has an inside, that there is a perspective that belongs to this specific tree in this specific location, that the tree is not merely a beautiful object, but a subject, a center of its own experience that the world looks different from, that deserves the same grammatical acknowledgement of presence that we give to a person standing at the forest's edge. The Greeks assigned specific dryads to specific species, encoded in their names. The Malei were spirits of the ash trees, born from the blood of the sky god when it fell to the earth. Born, that is, from the generative meeting of the celestial and the terrestrial, which is a description not without biological precision for what a tree actually is. A living bridge between the underground world of mineral and fungus and the upper world of atmosphere and light. An organism that exists precisely at the intersection of those two worlds and draws its life from both. And to cut down a tree without first propitiating the dryad, without acknowledging the presence that inhabited it and making the transaction one between two parties who both mattered, was understood as a moral violation. not superstition, but the encoding in religious language of an ecological recognition that the science of our century is arriving at from the other direction. That very old trees are not interchangeable with young trees. That the loss of a centuries-old individual represents the loss of something that cannot be replaced within a human time scale. That the network of fungal relationships and the accumulated biochemical record of 400 years of response to a specific place is a form of irreplaceable ecological knowledge. Gone when the tree is gone, the way a very old person's lifetime of experience is gone when they die, leaving a gap in the community that nothing can simply step into. Move now from Greece to North America, to the language spoken by the citizen Potawatomi Nation, whose people lived for centuries in the great forests of the Great Lakes region, and whose relationship with the living world was encoded in something even more fundamental than mythology, in grammar. And encounter the moment described by the botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is both a trained plant ecologist and an enrolled member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, when she began to learn her ancestral language as an adult after a lifetime of training in the vocabulary of Western science, and discovered that the distinction her new language made between the animate and the inanimate, between subjects and objects, between who and what, ran along a completely different line than the one drawn by English. Because in English rocks are things, water is a thing, trees are things, the bay you are standing beside is a thing. The grammar sorting all of these into the category of the inanimate, of that which can be described but not addressed, that which can be studied but not spoken to, that which has no perspective of its own that the language is required to acknowledge. Whereas in Potawatomi rocks are animate, water is animate, a bay is animate. The word for the bay carrying within it the same grammatical marker of subjecthood that carries the word for the person standing at its shore. The same implicit acknowledgement that the thing being named is a presence, is doing something, is here in a way that deserves the quality of attention one subject gives to another. And this is not metaphor in the Potawatomi grammar, not a poetic elevation of the inanimate for rhetorical effect, but a description, a claim about the nature of the world. That the category of the animate extends far beyond the boundaries that the English language and the civilization that developed alongside it drew around it. A claim that thousands of years of close attention to what it is actually like to live inside a particular piece of the living world had not disconfirmed. And when Kimmerer began to study this grammar alongside the science of mycorrhizal networks and plant behavior and the acoustic ecology of forests, she found the two systems arriving at the same conclusion from completely different directions, the science arriving there through the careful elimination of hypotheses and the design of progressively more rigorous experiments, and the patient measurement of isotope ratios and the recording of leaf vibrations with lasers, concluding tentatively and with the appropriate caveats that the living world is more active and more responsive and more genuinely doing things than the model of passive mechanism had assumed. And the language arriving there through thousands of years of living inside a particular piece of the living world and learning what it required, concluding without caveats and without the need for further confirmation that the rock and the water and the bay and the tree are here in the full sense that the word here can carry, and that a grammar which acknowledges this is more accurate than one which does not, more faithful to the actual character of the world it describes. Move further still, to the landscape of Celtic Ireland and Scotland and Wales, where a different tradition developed a different vocabulary for the same experience. The vocabulary of thin places, which in Celtic understanding was not a metaphor, but a description of a feature of the landscape. A specific location where the membrane between the ordinary surface of experience and whatever lay beneath it was notably more permeable than it was elsewhere, where the sense that the present moment was underlaid by something deeper and older and more continuous, was not a feeling you had to cultivate or a spiritual exercise you had to perform, but simply a quality of that particular place, as perceptible and as immediate as the smell of the sea or the temperature of the air, present in unremarkable places as often as in dramatic ones. A particular bend in a stream where the light fell in a specific way. A clearing in a wood where the silence had a quality different from the silence of the surrounding trees. A hillside where standing still for long enough produced a sensation that the ordinary vocabulary for sensations did not quite fit. Something closer to recognition than to anything new. The feeling of arriving somewhere that had always been there in a way that your ordinary perception had simply not been tuned to receive. What the Celtic tradition was describing, with this vocabulary of thinness and permeability, is what every tradition we are visiting tonight reaches toward from its own direction. The experience of the ordinary filter of perception becoming briefly less absolute. And through that brief lessening, something older and more continuous becoming perceptible. The living world suddenly exceeding the category of living world and becoming something that is present in itself and not merely as backdrop, something that has been attending all along. And further still, deeper into the southern hemisphere and into the forests of the Amazon basin, where the traditions of the Shipibo and Shuar and dozens of other peoples whose cultures grew up inside one of the most biologically complex ecosystems on the surface of the planet have for centuries maintained a practice of entering into direct communication with plants. Not metaphorically, not as a technique for accessing the contents of the unconscious, but as a literal technology of receiving information from the living world, based on a cosmology in which the plants of the forest are understood to be teachers, sources of knowledge, beings with information to transmit to human beings who have prepared themselves to receive it. And the ethnobotanist Jeremy Narby, who spent years living alongside people practicing these traditions and who was one of the few Western-trained scientists to approach their claims without the prior certainty that they were projection or hallucination, came to a conclusion as strange as the traditions themselves, that the specific and verifiable knowledge about plant chemistry and ecosystem relationships that people report receiving in these visionary states, knowledge that Western pharmacology has subsequently confirmed in study after study, exceeds what could plausibly be explained as the projection of what was already known, and that the question of what mechanism could explain it, if not the mechanism the tradition itself describes, is one that science has not yet honestly faced. Cross the Pacific now, to Japan, to the tradition of Shinto, which is built not on a founding narrative or a set of doctrines, but on the recognition that the world is pervaded by kami, by presences that inhabit specific places and specific natural forms, presences that are not gods in the Western sense, but something closer to what the Potawatomi grammar encodes in its category of the animate. The acknowledgement that place and stone and waterfall and ancient tree have a presence, a being here, that demands a specific quality of attention and a specific quality of relationship. And the specific stones that stand in Shinto shrines and in specific positions in the landscape are not symbols of the sacred, but locations of it. The specific points in the physical world where a specific presence is most perceptible, where what the Celts would have called the thinness of the place is concentrated. A stone that the Potawatomi grammar calls animate, and the Shinto tradition calls inhabited, and the geologist calls a record of the conditions under which it formed, and the physicist calls a lattice of crystallized matter maintaining its arrangement against entropy, and that tonight we are calling, with the appropriate tentativeness and the genuine uncertainty and the honest acknowledgement that the question remains open, possibly present in some register and at some frequency of being here, that the ordinary human nervous system, in its ordinary mode of operation, does not consistently receive, but that 5 independent traditions arising on 5 continents without contact with each other have consistently pointed toward, consistently described in the only vocabularies available to them, consistently encoded as something real and something requiring acknowledgement, and something that changes the quality of every subsequent relationship between a human being and the world they are part of when they stop treating it as backdrop and begin treating it as community. There is a philosopher who arrives at the edge of this question from an angle so different from the mystics and the poets and the indigenous knowledge holders and the scientists that his presence here might seem surprising. And yet, whose thinking, followed honestly, converges on the same ground. William James, who was simultaneously the founder of American psychology and one of the most rigorous philosophers of consciousness who ever wrote in English, and who spent the final years of his life developing what he called radical empiricism, a philosophy that begins not with the assumption that consciousness is the private property of creatures with brains and works outward from there, but with the question of where the evidence actually leads when you follow it without the prior commitment to a particular answer. And the evidence, James argued, does not clearly indicate where consciousness ends, because what we know about other human beings' consciousness is not direct observation, but inference. Inference from behavior, from the similarity of their architecture to our own, from the reports they give of their inner states. And if we are honest about the limits of that inference, if we acknowledge that the confidence we have in other people's consciousness is based on analogy rather than verification, then the question of where consciousness ends, of where the experiencing world gives way to the merely mechanical world, is not resolved by saying it ends at the skull or at the boundary of the vertebrate nervous system, because those boundaries were drawn not on the basis of evidence, but on the basis of the assumptions of a particular civilization at a particular moment. And the evidence that is currently accumulating in the field of plant biology does not confirm them. James was not alone in this intuition, because the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, writing in the early 19th century, argued that beneath the surface diversity of all the world's phenomena, beneath every individual thing acting in its individual way, there is a single underlying principle that he called the will, a directionless and purposeless striving that is present everywhere, expressing itself differently through different forms of matter, but everywhere the same in its essential nature. The human being willing toward what it loves, and the bird willing toward its migration, and the root willing toward water, and the fungal filament willing toward the phosphorus it needs, and the river willing toward the sea, each of them the same underlying force expressing itself through a different architecture at a different speed in a different register of time and space, so that the plant growing toward light was not in Schopenhauer's understanding merely a mechanical response to a chemical gradient, any more than a person reaching for what they love is merely a mechanical response to a neurochemical gradient, even though it is also that. But the same underlying striving, expressing itself through a different form, at the different tempo and in the different language of the vegetable world. A world whose language we have not learned to hear, not because it does not speak, but because we have not been patient enough or quiet enough to listen. And James Lovelock, the English chemist who spent his career designing instruments for NASA, and who was assigned the problem of designing an experiment to detect life on Mars, came back from that problem with the insight that the entire chemistry of the Earth's atmosphere was a signature of life, that the wild disequilibrium of oxygen and methane and nitrogen in the air could only be maintained by the continuous activity of living systems in a relationship with their inorganic environment so intimate and so sustained as that it deserved at the very least the word system, and perhaps something stronger than that. and he named his hypothesis Gaia, after the Greek goddess of the earth, at the suggestion of his neighbor, the novelist William Golding, and noted that country people who lived close to the land tended to find the hypothesis obvious, tended to be puzzled that anyone would need to demonstrate formally something as evident as the fact that the earth was alive in some meaningful sense, that it was not a passive stage on which life performed, but a participant in the drama, maintaining the conditions for its own continuation across timescales so vast that the word maintenance barely contains the achievement. And whether the earth is conscious in any sense that would satisfy a philosopher, whether the living world has experience in any sense that would satisfy a scientist, none of these thinkers and none of the experiments we have described tonight can definitively answer. But they are all pressing against the same edge, the edge of what a consciousness trained to sort the world into subjects and objects can hold about the actual depth and complexity of the living world it is part of. And at that edge, from every direction, what they find is the same thing, which is that there is more here than the categories accommodate, more presence and more responsiveness and more of something that functions like experience, regardless of whether it is accompanied by experience in the full philosophical sense, more of the qualities we associate with being here and mattering and having a perspective from which the world looks different than it does from any other position. Charles Darwin, the man whose theory of natural selection became the foundation of modern biology, spent the final decade of his life not on islands or aboard ships, but in his garden in Kent, studying the behavior of earthworms, watching them move through soil and process leaf litter and plug the entrances to their burrows with stones and leaves. And he reached a conclusion that surprised even him, that the earthworm exercises something that in any other animal he would have called judgment, choosing which leaf to use to plug a burrow and selecting the right end of a pine needle for grasping, making in each small decision the choice that worked better rather than the choice that worked less well, without, as far as anatomy could determine, any neural structure remotely sophisticated enough to house the kind of deliberation those choices seemed to require. And Darwin was not given to anthropomorphism, not inclined to project experience where the evidence did not support it. And the conclusion he drew nonetheless, from years of watching the simplest and most overlooked organisms in the soil make their small and consistent choices, was that the line between mechanism and something more than mechanism was less clear than his century assumed. And that observation is still there, still sitting in the pages of his final book, like a door that was opened slightly and not yet fully walked through, still suggesting that the experience of being something does not require the particular architecture that the Western tradition decided was its necessary condition. The philosopher Thomas Nagel asked, in a famous paper from 1974, what it is like to be a bat. And his point was not about bats specifically, but about the structure of the question, about the fact that it makes sense to ask, that we understand what it would mean to ask it, even if we cannot answer it, that there is something it is like to be a bat navigating by echolocation in the dark, something that is not captured by any amount of description of the physical mechanics of echolocation, no matter how precise, and the point generalizes outward without finding a natural stopping place. Because if there is something it is like to be a bat, then there is something it is like to be a fish, and something it is like to be an octopus. And once you have followed the question that far, the next question is where it stops. And the honest answer is that we do not know where it stops. That the line we have drawn between the things that have an inside and the things that are only outside was drawn not on the basis of evidence, but on the basis of the assumption that experience requires the kind of neural architecture we are most familiar with, which is our own. And the mimosa has no neural architecture, and the mycorrhizal network has no neural architecture, and the 400-year-old oak has no neurons and no synapses and no structure that a neuroanatomist would recognize as the substrate of experience. And yet, the mimosa remembers, and the pea plant learns, and the oak's chemistry responds to the stress of its neighbors in a way that changes its own future. And whether there is something it is like to be the mimosa learning that this particular fall is safe, whether there is something it is like to be the old oak networked into its forest through centuries of fungal relationship, we honestly and genuinely and completely do not know. And the not knowing, when it is held honestly without being filled in prematurely by either the comfortable yes of easy animism or the equally comfortable no of confident mechanism, is one of the most genuinely alive places that a question can be, the place where the door is neither open nor closed, but ajar, which is the position from which the most interesting things become visible. Let the thinking grow softer now, and let the images settle like leaves settling into still water after the wind has passed, and let the breath find whatever depth it has been looking for all evening. Because what remains when the science and the mythology and the philosophy have said what they have to say is not a conclusion, but a quality of the particular night that is gathered around you, a quality of the air in this room that has been breathed by other things before it was yours and will be breathed by other things after, a quality of the silence that is not empty but inhabited, not absence, but the particular presence of everything that is here in the dark, continuing its own version of being here while you rest from yours, and the quality that matters most tonight. The quality that this particular story was built to deliver into the body before sleep is not information and not argument, but simply this: the felt sense of belonging to something larger and older and more patient than the ordinary drama of a day allows the living world to appear. Notice the body, not to examine it or assess it or find what needs attention, but simply to feel it as what it is, which is a temporary arrangement of matter that the universe has been working toward for 4.5 billion years, that the living world has been practicing the particular tricks of complexity and self-organization that produced it for 3.5 billion years, that arrived at this specific configuration through a chain of improbable survivals and transformations so long that it cannot be held whole by the imagination but can only be gestured at. And the carbon in your body was before it was yours in the atmosphere, captured by photosynthesis, incorporated into the tissue of something that grew in sunlight, moved through the long chain of eating and being eaten and decomposing and returning to the soil and being captured again until it arrived here, in these cells, doing the specific work that carbon does in a living body, which is everything, which is the structure of every molecule that constitutes the architecture of what you are. And the oxygen in your lungs right now was inside a tree before it was inside you, was a product of photosynthesis, was released as what the tree was done with, was the tree's waste and is now your sustenance. In an exchange that has been running continuously between the green parts of the world and the breathing parts for as long as there have been both, an exchange so fundamental and so ancient that it is not a metaphor for relationship, but the relationship itself. The most basic level at which you and the living world are not separate things, but one process, temporarily differentiated into the form of a tree and the form of a person, but made of the same matter, doing the same thing, which is transform, which is continue, which is find the next form that works and inhabit it fully and without reservation until the next transformation arrives. You are made of forest, not as a figure of speech and not as a philosophical position, but as a chemical fact, as precise and as verifiable as any fact available to a laboratory. And the stone on the hillside that the Potawatomi grammar calls animate. the stone that carries in its crystal structure the record of the conditions under which it formed, is made of the same matter too. Matter that has simply arrived at a slower and more patient configuration. Matter that has taken the form of stability and endurance rather than the form of growth and movement. That holds its particular arrangement against the forces that work to dissolve it for longer than any organism manages. That is here, in the deepest available sense of the word here, has been here since before the forest, will be hereafter, is here right now in whatever direction from wherever you are lying is closest to open ground, holding its form in the dark the way you are holding yours, but with a patience for which the human nervous system has no equivalent. A patience that has been practicing itself since before the continents were in their current positions. Since before the mountains that surround it were mountains, since before the species that would eventually develop the concept of patience had developed anything at all. The network beneath the soil is working now, in whatever forest exists within range of the place where you are lying, transferring, distributing, doing its slow and undramatic and utterly continuous work in the mineral dark. The same work it has been doing since before the first flower opened on the surface of the earth. With the same patience and the same completeness and the same absence of hurry that it has always brought to everything it does, which is total. Because patient things do not hurry and do not delay. They simply continue. At the pace that 450 million years of practice has determined is the right pace for this particular work, in this particular darkness. The mimosa has made its assessment of the night and found it safe and is resting in whatever way a plant rests. Its leaves open, its chemistry quiet, its memory of the harmless fall still encoded in the molecular configurations that constitute its own form of remembering, holding that information in whatever form information takes, when there is no brain to hold it, in the chemistry of the cell walls, or the ion concentrations of the cytoplasm, or the configuration of the receptor proteins on the surfaces of 10,000 cells. Each of them carrying its portion of the thing that was learned, distributed through the organism, the way everything in a plant is distributed, without a center, without a hierarchy, without the concentrated architecture that an animal nervous system uses, and yet held, and held for weeks, and held in a form that is available to shape future behavior, which is what a memory is, which is all a memory needs to be. And the very old tree, the one that has been on its hillside for 400 years, that has survived 17 generations of the weather of that particular slope, and is now connected to the trees around it by fungal networks so extensive that the boundary between its root system and the forest's root system is not a boundary at all, but a gradation, a slow dissolving of the individual into the community that mirrors in the world below ground what every tradition and every scientist who has looked carefully has found in the world above. That tree is doing what it does in the quiet of this night, which is continue, simply continue, with a patience and a completeness and an absolute lack of urgency that is, from the inside of a human nervous system calibrated for exactly the opposite, for urgency and the rapid assessment of threat and opportunity, and the particular anxiety of a creature whose survival has always depended on speed, deeply and strangely restful to contemplate, the way the contemplation of very large and very patient things is always restful to a nervous system that has been operating at the wrong speed all day, and recognizes, in the presence of something slower and more certain, a quality of rest that is not the absence of activity, but the presence of a different relationship to time, to become, for these remaining minutes of a night that is already more than half dissolved into the territory of sleep, a little more like the tree than like the animal. To let the urgency that the day required loosen its grip, to let the speed that the hours demanded slow toward the pace at which the sap moves and the fungal filament navigates and the stone holds its arrangement against the forces working to dissolve it. to let the particular quality of patience that 400 million years of being alive in this particular world produced settle into the body, the way warmth settles, the way the sense of being held settles, the way sleep settles, from the edges inward, from the extremities toward the center, from the surfaces toward whatever it is that lies beneath the surfaces. Older and quieter and more continuous than anything the ordinary waking mind has time to be aware of. But present, always present. Present right now in the body that is lying here, and in the breath that is moving through it, and in the quality of the dark that is gathered around everything that is trying to rest in it tonight. You are not separate from the living world. And you have never been separate from the living world, and the story that says you are. The story that puts you on one side of a line and the forest on the other. The story that makes the tree an object, and you, the subject. The stone a resource, and you the one who uses it. The mycorrhizal network a mechanism, and you the consciousness that observes it. That story is a recent story. Is the story of a particular civilization at a particular moment in the history of a species that has been telling stories for much longer than it has been telling that one, and that before it told that one told different stories. Stories in which the rock and the water and the tree and the bay were animate, were present, were here in the full sense of the word, were members of the same community as the person standing at the forest's edge and feeling in the particular quality of the silence, that something was attending, and the fact that those older stories came from every culture on every continent that has ever lived close to the land, and the fact that the science of our moment is slowly and carefully and with the appropriate tentativeness arriving at the same recognition by a completely different road is not a coincidence that can be easily dismissed, is rather the shape of something true, making itself visible through whatever materials a given tradition has available to express it. The same shape appearing in the grammar of the Potawatomi nation and in the mythological system of ancient Greece, and in the careful experiments of plant biologists working in laboratories in the 21st century. All of them finding, with the instruments appropriate to their moment, the same thing. That the living world is here in a fuller sense than the category of backdrop allows, and that the quality of relationship available between a human consciousness and the rest of the living world changes when this is acknowledged, becomes richer and more honest and more alive to what is actually present. Let that recognition settle into the body now, not as a thought to be held, but as a weight to be released. The weight of the story that placed you outside the living world, the weight of the category that made you the observer rather than the participant. And let the world do what it does while you sleep, which is what it has always done, which is continue, the network transferring, and the stone holding, and the old tree in its dark and patient completeness, the air moving between the living and the still, the boundary between subject and object, thinning the way it always thins at this hour, the way it always thins in the quality of attention that is half asleep and half awake, and belongs, for this brief threshold interval, to neither entirely, and in that thinning let the living world be what it actually is. Let it be the community of subjects that includes without ceremony and without exception, and the one who is breathing in the dark right now, the one who is lying here in the warmth of a night that has gathered everything together and made it quiet, the one who is, even now, without needing to do anything at all, part of the great and ancient and utterly unhurried conversation that the living world has been having with itself since before there were ears to hear it, which is the same conversation as the silence, which is the same conversation as the breath, which is the same conversation as the dark that holds you now, gently, completely, in the way that only very old and very patient things can hold. not tightly, not with any urgency, but with the simple and complete certainty of something that has been doing this for longer than memory reaches and intends, in its unhurried way, to continue. Good night.